"Don't you dare touch my car with those filthy hands." Astrid Cole's voice cut through the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel like a blade, every syllable dripping with the kind of contempt that money could buy and breeding could refine. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed accusingly at the maintenance worker who'd accidentally brushed against her pristine white Maserati while wheeling a cleaning cart past the valet stand. The man looked up from where he knelt beside his overturned supplies, his worn work clothes a stark contrast to the marble opulence surrounding them. But instead of the cowering apology Astrid expected, she found herself staring into eyes that held something she wasn't used to seeing from service staff: complete, unimpressed calm. "I apologize," he said quietly, his voice carrying an odd refinement that seemed at odds with his janitor's uniform. "I'll be more careful." "More careful?" Astrid's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea what that car costs? More than you'll make in 10 lifetimes, I guarantee it." The lobby had gone silent around them, guests and staff frozen in a tableau of second-hand embarrassment. But Judd Austin Willoughby, though Astrid didn't know his real name, simply continued gathering his scattered cleaning supplies with methodical precision. "I'm sure you're right," he replied, and something in his tone made Astrid's eyes narrow. Was he mocking her? "Security," she snapped, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I want this man fired immediately. And I want to speak to your manager about the quality of staff you're hiring." The hotel manager, Heiress Webb, appeared with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Miss Cole, I'm terribly sorry for any inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" Astrid's voice rose another octave. This person has contaminated my vehicle with his poverty. I want him gone, and I want compensation for the detailing I'll need to have done." Judd straightened slowly, and for just a moment, Astrid caught something in his posture that didn't match his humble clothing. The way he held himself, the quiet authority in his movements, it was almost familiar, though she couldn't place why. "Perhaps," Judd said, meeting her gaze directly, "we should let the owner decide what kind of staff his hotel employs." The audacity of it took Astrid's breath away. A janitor, speaking to her as if they were equals, suggesting that some mysterious owner would side with him over her, a Cole, whose family had been funding high society charity galas since before this man was born. The owner? Astrid laughed again, but this time it sounded forced even to her own ears. "Trust me, sweetheart, when he hears about this incident, you'll be lucky to find work cleaning toilets at a roadside diner. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description." Judd's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or pity. "I'll keep that in mind," he said simply. "See that you do." Astrid turned to Harrison, who was sweating despite the lobby's perfect climate control. "I expect a full report of this man's termination on my desk by tomorrow morning. The Cole Foundation contributes significantly to this establishment's charity events, and I won't hesitate to recommend we take our business elsewhere if this isn't handled properly." "Of course, Miss Cole," Harrison stammered. "We'll handle this immediately." But as Astrid stalked toward the elevator, her designer heels clicking imperiously against the marble floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a terrible mistake. There'd been something about the way the janitor looked at her, not with the deference she was accustomed to from service workers, but with the cool assessment of someone who saw right through her carefully constructed facade. The elevator doors closed behind her, cutting off her view of the lobby where Judd was calmly returning to his work, seemingly unaffected by the scene she'd just created. But Astrid's reflection in the polished elevator walls showed a woman whose confidence had been shaken by something she couldn't quite identify. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her father's name. Charles Cole would want to hear about this incident, not because he cared about janitors or car contamination, but because maintaining their family's reputation was everything to him. "Daddy," she said when he answered. "We need to talk. I just had the most appalling experience at the Grand Meridian. The staff there clearly don't understand who they're dealing with." But instead of the righteous indignation she expected, her father's voice carried an edge of distraction that made her stomach clench with sudden unease. "Astrid, not now. I'm dealing with a crisis." "What kind of crisis?" The pause before he answered lasted too long. "The Singapore deal fell through. We're in trouble, sweetheart. Real trouble." The elevator reached her floor, but Astrid remained frozen as the doors opened and closed again. The Singapore deal, the massive construction contract that was supposed to secure coal industries for the next decade, was gone. "How much trouble?" she whispered. "The kind where we might need to start making some very difficult decisions about our assets," Charles said quietly. "Including the foundation. Including your trust fund. Including everything we've built." As the elevator descended back toward the lobby, carrying Astrid toward a future she'd never imagined possible, she had no idea that the janitor she'd just humiliated was the only person in the city with both the power and the resources to save her family from complete financial ruin. And she certainly had no idea that he'd been watching the Cole family's business dealings with the same quiet attention he just paid to her character, finding both far more revealing than either Charles or Astrid would have liked. The elevator doors opened again, and Astrid stepped out into a world that suddenly felt far less certain than it had 20 minutes ago. 3 hours later, Astrid sat in her father's study, watching the man who taught her that Cole blood meant never having to apologize crumble before her eyes. Charles Cole, industry titan, political kingmaker, the man who'd built an empire from a single construction contract 40 years ago, looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of papers scattered across his mahogany desk. "How bad is it really?" Astrid asked, her voice smaller than it had been in the hotel lobby. Here, surrounded by photos of 3 generations of Cole's success, the harsh reality felt surreal. "We leveraged everything on the Singapore project," Charles admitted, rubbing his temples with hands that suddenly looked older than his 62 years. "The hotel chains, the construction company, even the foundation's endowment. When Morrison Industries pulled out, they took our financing with them." Astrid stared at him, struggling to process the magnitude of what he was saying. "But we have other projects, other investments. All tied to credit lines that Morrison guaranteed. Without them, the banks are calling in our loans. We have 30 days before they start seizing assets." The study fell silent except for the antique grandfather clock that had been Charles's wedding gift to her mother. Eleanor Cole's portrait smiled down from above the fireplace, frozen in a moment when the family name still meant security instead of impending scandal. "Mom would have known what to do," Astrid whispered. Charles's face softened with grief that never quite healed. "Your mother understood people in ways I never learned. She could read a room, sense the currents beneath the surface. If she were here." He trailed off, lost in memories of the woman who died when Astrid was 15. That loss had shaped everything about who Astrid had become, the armor of arrogance, the desperate need to prove her worth through material success, the fear of vulnerability that made her lash out at anyone who reminded her of her own fragility. Without Eleanor's gentle guidance, she'd learned to navigate the world through her father's harsher lessons about power and control. "There has to be something we can do," Astrid said, but even as the words left her mouth, she heard the desperation in her own voice. "Someone we can call, some favor we can leverage." "I've tried everything," Charles replied. "Every contact, every political connection, every board member who owes us favors. The Singapore deal was too big, Astrid. When it collapsed, it took our credibility with it. While the Cole family grappled with their impending downfall, Judd Austin Willoughby stood in his real office on the 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, reviewing security footage from the lobby incident. The penthouse office was a study in understated luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, custom furniture that cost more than most people's homes, artwork that belonged in museums. But Judd's attention was focused on the monitors showing Astrid's performance from multiple angles. He'd been conducting these undercover observations for 6 months, documenting how his hotels really operated when the staff thought no one important was watching. What he'd discovered had been both illuminating and disturbing. "Sir." His assistant, Rebecca Chen, entered with a tablet full of reports. "The Cole incident has been processed through legal. Harrison's recommending we ban her from all Meridian properties." "Cancel that recommendation," Judd said without taking his eyes off the screen. "In fact, I want a full background check on the Cole family. Financial records, business dealings, everything." Rebecca raised an eyebrow but made the note. She'd worked for Judd long enough to recognize when he was pursuing something beyond normal business interest. "Any particular reason?" Judd paused the video on Astrid's face, studying the moment when her mask of superiority had slipped, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. "Call it curiosity about human nature." "And the janitor position?" "I'll continue it for now. There's more to learn." What Judd didn't tell Rebecca was that Astrid Cole reminded him of someone he'd once been, someone who'd used cruelty as a shield against his own insecurities, who believed that money could protect him from the kind of pain that came from genuine human connection. His own transformation had come at a terrible cost. 7 years ago, his younger brother Marcus had died in a car accident, fleeing from a confrontation where Judd had chosen business over family, profit over compassion. The guilt had driven him to rebuild not just his company's practices, but his own understanding of what success really meant. The undercover work wasn't just about improving hotel operations, it was about understanding the human cost of the inequality he'd helped create, about seeing the world through the eyes of people he'd spent his life dismissing. Back in the Cole study, Astrid's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Vivian, "Emergency board meeting at the foundation tomorrow. Rumors flying about funding issues." "What's going on?" The Cole Foundation, her mother's legacy, the charitable organization that had been Astrid's one genuine source of pride, was apparently already feeling the ripple effects of their financial crisis. "The foundation can't survive this, can it?" she asked her father. Charles shook his head slowly. "The endowment is collateral for the Morrison loan. When that gets called in, we'll lose everything Mom built." The words came out flat, emotionless, because the alternative was breaking down completely. "There might be one option," Charles said carefully. "I've heard rumors about a private investor who's been buying distressed properties in the city. Someone with enough liquidity to absorb our debt and keep the companies operational." "What kind of investor?" "The kind who prefers anonymity. But they've apparently saved several families from situations similar to ours. The catch is they're extremely selective about who they help." Astrid felt a flicker of hope mixed with humiliation. The idea of begging some mysterious financier for salvation went against everything she'd been taught about Cole pride, but the alternative was losing everything her family had built. "How do we contact them?" "We don't. They contact us, if they're interested. Usually through intermediaries, often in unexpected ways." As if summoned by their conversation, Charles's phone rang. He answered with the weary professionalism of a man expecting more bad news. "Charles Cole." "Yes, I see. Tonight?" "That's rather short notice." "Very well, we'll be there." He hung up, his expression shifting from resignation to confused hope. "What was that?" Astrid asked. "An invitation to a private dinner at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The caller claimed to represent a potential investor interested in discussing our situation." The Grand Meridian, the same hotel where she'd humiliated the janitor just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "Should we go?" Charles stood, straightening his tie with the automatic gesture of a man who'd spent decades projecting confidence even when he felt none. "At this point, we can't afford not to." That evening, as Astrid dressed for what might be their family's last hope, she found herself thinking about the maintenance worker's eyes. There'd been something unsettling about his calm composure, about the way he'd spoken to her as if her threats meant nothing. She'd built her identity around the certainty that her wealth and status made her untouchable, that people like janitors existed in a different sphere entirely. But something about that interaction had shaken her foundation in ways she didn't fully understand. As she applied her makeup, preparing to play the role of the confident Cole heiress one more time, Astrid had no idea that the janitor she dismissed was the same mysterious investor who might hold her family's fate in his hands. And she certainly didn't know that Judd Austin Willoughby had already decided that Astrid Cole needed to learn the same hard lessons about humanity that had transformed his own life, whether she wanted to or not. The dinner invitation was just the beginning of an education that would either destroy her or rebuild her into someone worthy of the second chance she didn't yet know she desperately needed. As the Coles prepared to humble themselves before a stranger, neither father nor daughter realized they were walking into a test that would reveal not just their financial desperation, but the true content of their characters. The first betrayal was about to unfold, and it would come from the last person Astrid expected to hold power over her world. The Grand Meridian's private dining room existed in a realm of understated elegance that made even the Cole family's wealth seem quaint by comparison. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany paneling while floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that money couldn't buy, only power could command. Astrid smoothed her black cocktail dress nervously as she and her father were led to a table set for three. The mysterious investor was already 15 minutes late, and each passing moment felt like another nail in their financial coffin. "Remember," Charles murmured under his breath, "we're here to listen, not to negotiate from strength. Whatever they want, we consider it." The words tasted like ash in Astrid's mouth. 3 generations of Cole pride reduced to desperate begging in a hotel dining room. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole." A voice spoke from behind them, refined and oddly familiar. Astrid turned and found herself face to face with a man who made her breath catch in her throat. Tall, impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her car, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that came from good genetics and better breeding, but there was something else, a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Cole, actually," she corrected automatically, extending her hand. "I'm not married." "Forgive me," the stranger said, taking her hand with just enough pressure to send electricity up her arm. "Julian Westbrook." "Thank you both for coming on such short notice." Julian Westbrook. The name meant nothing to Astrid, but the way he carried himself suggested someone accustomed to having his time valued above all else. "Mr. Westbrook," Charles stood, his businessman's instincts kicking in despite their desperate circumstances. "We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Julian gestured for them to sit, and Astrid found herself studying his profile as he took his own chair. There was something naggingly familiar about the line of his jaw, the way he held his head, but she couldn't place it. "I'll be direct," Julian said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being told, "No, your family's situation has come to my attention. The Singapore collapse, the leveraged assets, the foundation's exposure, it's a complicated web." "You're remarkably well informed," Charles replied carefully. "Information is the only real currency in business," Julian said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The question is what you're willing to do with accurate information when you receive it." Astrid felt heat rise in her cheeks. Something about his tone suggested criticism, though she couldn't identify what they'd done to deserve it. "We're prepared to discuss any reasonable terms," she said, trying to project the confidence that had carried her through a lifetime of privilege. Julian's gaze settled on her with uncomfortable intensity. Are you? Because saving Cole Industries would require more than financial restructuring. It would require fundamental changes in how your family operates. What kind of changes? Charles asked. The kind that strip away pretense and reveal character, Julian replied, his attention still focused on Astrid. Your daughter, for instance, has a reputation for treating service staff with particular disdain. That would need to change. Astrid's stomach dropped. How could he possibly know about her behavior toward hotel employees? Unless... I don't understand what my interactions with staff have to do with business restructuring, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Everything, Julian said simply. The companies I invest in succeed because they understand that human capital is their most valuable asset. Leaders who can't treat a janitor with basic respect rarely inspire loyalty in anyone else. The words hit like physical blows. Astrid's mind raced, trying to connect this elegant stranger to her earlier humiliation. It wasn't possible. The janitor had been ordinary, unremarkable, nothing like the magnetic presence sitting across from her now. Perhaps we could focus on the financial aspects, Charles interjected, sensing his daughter's discomfort. By all means, Julian agreed, pulling out a tablet and swiping through documents with practiced efficiency. Cole Industries currently owes $47 million across various credit lines. The foundation's endowment is pledged as collateral for another $18 million. Your personal assets, the house, the cars, the art collection, would cover perhaps 20% of the total debt. The clinical precision with which he dissected their downfall was somehow more devastating than the numbers themselves. However, Julian continued, I'm prepared to offer a complete bailout under specific conditions. Name them, Charles said immediately. Your daughter works for me for 1 year. Full-time, on-site, starting at the bottom of the organizational chart. She learns how businesses actually function from the ground up. Astrid's mouth fell open. Excuse me. The Cole family has operated on inherited privilege for 3 generations, Julian explained with detached professionalism. Your daughter has never held a real job, never experienced genuine consequences for her actions, never learned that respect is earned rather than demanded. Those gaps in her education have become liabilities. This is ridiculous, Astrid snapped, her famous temper finally overriding her shock. I graduated summa cum laude from Wharton. I've been managing foundation operations since I was 25. I don't need to learn anything from people you consider beneath you. Julian's voice carried a dangerous edge that made her words die in her throat. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Charles looked between his daughter and their potential savior, clearly calculating whether pride was worth more than survival. What specific role are you proposing? He asked finally. Customer service. Frontline staff. She'll interact with every level of employee and customer, from maintenance workers to executive clients. She'll learn that treating people badly has consequences, for business, for morale, for basic human decency. Astrid felt the room spinning around her. You want me to be a hotel clerk? I want you to understand the difference between authority and leadership, Julian replied. Between inherited status and earned respect. Between the person you've chosen to become and the person you could be. The words cut deeper than any insult because they carried an undertone of disappointment that felt almost personal. As if this stranger had expected better from her and found her wanting. And if I refuse? Julian's smile was sharp as winter. Then Cole Industries files for bankruptcy next week, your family loses everything, and your mother's foundation disappears forever. Your choice. Charles reached across the table, gripping Astrid's hand with desperate strength. Sweetheart, this might be our only option. The position comes with a salary, Julian added, as if discussing the weather. $35,000 annually, plus standard benefits. You'll live in employee housing, follow the same rules as every other staff member, and report to managers who won't care about your family name. $35,000. Astrid spent more than that on clothes each year. The idea of surviving on such a pittance felt as foreign as moving to another planet. "How do I know you'll honor your end of the deal?" she asked, grasping for any semblance of control in the negotiation. "You don't," Julian said bluntly. "Just like every other employee in the world, you'll have to trust that good performance leads to positive outcomes." Novel concept, I know. The sarcasm stung because it was accurate. Astrid had never had to trust anyone for her financial security, it had always been guaranteed by birth. "There's one more condition," Julian continued, his voice softening slightly. "No contact with family or friends for the first month. Complete immersion in your new life. You need to understand what independence actually feels like." "That's isolation, not independence," Astrid protested. "Is it? Or is it the first time you'll discover who you are when nobody's there to clean up your mistakes?" As the question hung in the air, Astrid realized she was looking into the eyes of someone who saw right through her carefully constructed facade. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was a challenge to everything she believed about herself and her place in the world. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Julian replied, standing with fluid grace. "The offer expires at 9 a.m. whether you accept it or not. Other families are interested in my assistance." As he moved toward the door, something about his posture triggered a memory, the way he'd knelt beside his cleaning cart, the quiet dignity in his movements, the unsettling calm in his eyes. "Wait," Astrid called out, her heart pounding. "Have we met before?" Julian paused at the threshold, and when he turned back, his smile carried secrets that made her blood run cold. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said. "Until now." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the sealing of her fate. Astrid sat in a suddenly oppressive silence, trying to process what had just happened. "We have to take the deal," Charles said quietly. "There's no other choice." But Astrid barely heard him. Her mind was racing, connecting details that didn't quite fit, the familiar cadence of Julian's voice, the way he'd moved, the specific knowledge about her behavior toward hotel staff. The janitor. The elegant investor. Two completely different men who somehow shared the same unsettling ability to see straight through her defenses. As the implications crashed over her like cold water, Astrid realized she wasn't just agreeing to a job, she was walking into a trap set by someone who already knew exactly how to destroy her. And the worst part was, she had no choice but to spring it willingly. Astrid's first day as a Grand Meridian Hotel customer service representative began at 5:47 a.m. when her alarm clock, a cheap plastic model from the employee housing complex, shattered the silence of her tiny studio apartment. The space was smaller than her childhood walk-in closet, furnished with items that looked like they'd been salvaged from a budget motel liquidation sale. She stared at the water-stained ceiling, trying to summon the courage to begin what felt like a prison sentence disguised as employment. 3 weeks had passed since she'd signed Julian Westbrook's contract, 3 weeks of watching her former life disintegrate while learning to navigate a world where her family name meant nothing. The employee housing complex buzzed with the pre-dawn energy of people who worked for living rather than leisure. Astrid pulled on the polyester uniform that made her skin crawl, a navy blazer with the Grand Meridian logo, white blouse, and sensible shoes that looked like medical equipment, and tried to remember Julian's words about earning respect rather than demanding it. The hotel's employee entrance led through a maze of service corridors that Astrid had never imagined existed behind the glamorous facade she'd always known. Workers moved with purposeful efficiency, their conversations peppered with the kind of casual profanity and dark humor that came from shared struggle. "You must be the new girl," said Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide her skepticism. I'm your supervisor. Customer service desk, second shift. Astrid Cole, she caught herself just in time. Astrid Martinez. The fake surname Julian had assigned felt foreign on her tongue. Right. Martinez. Maria's tone suggested she wasn't fooled by the obvious deception, but she was professional enough not to press. Let's get you started. The customer service desk existed in a glass-walled office visible to both guests and management, a fishbowl where every interaction was observed and evaluated. Astrid's first customer was a businessman whose credit card had been declined, his face red with embarrassment as he explained that his company was experiencing temporary cash flow issues. 6 months ago, Astrid would have looked down on someone whose finances were so precarious. Now, watching him struggle to maintain dignity while his card was repeatedly rejected, she felt an uncomfortable stab of recognition. "Let me see what I can do," she heard herself saying, her voice softer than her usual commanding tone. "Sometimes the system has glitches that we can work around." It wasn't true, the man's account was simply overdrawn, but Astrid found herself quietly covering his room charges from her own meager paycheck, telling him that system error had been resolved. "Thank you," he said, relief flooding his features. "You don't know what this means to me." But Astrid was beginning to understand exactly what it meant. She was learning the weight of financial vulnerability, the crushing humiliation of depending on others' mercy, the way poverty made people invisible to those who'd never experienced it. From across the lobby, Julian Westbrook watched the interaction with something approaching approval. He'd been monitoring Astrid's progress through a network of managers and security cameras, documenting every small victory and devastating failure as she adjusted to life outside her protective bubble of privilege. What he hadn't expected was how her genuine moments of kindness would affect his own carefully constructed emotional distance. The way she'd helped the embarrassed businessman, the late nights he'd observed her studying hotel procedures in the employee break room, the gradual softening of her voice when she spoke to the housekeeping staff, it was becoming harder to maintain his role as detached observer. "Sir." Rebecca Chen appeared beside him with a tablet full of reports. "The Cole family's financial review is complete. They're worse off than we initially calculated." Julian accepted the tablet without taking his eyes off Astrid, who was now patiently explaining reservation policies to an elderly couple with limited English. Her former self would have dismissed them as beneath her attention, but this new version was taking extra time to ensure they understood their options. "How much worse?" "Charles Cole has been borrowing against assets that don't exist," Rebecca explained. "The Foundation's books show embezzlement going back 5 years. If the authorities discover it, prison time. For both father and daughter, potentially." She signed off on several of the questionable transfers. Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd intended to teach Astrid about humility and genuine human connection, not destroy her family completely. The financial investigation he'd ordered was revealing crimes that went far beyond poor business decisions. Could she have known? The signatures suggest she was involved in the cover-up, whether she understood the implications or not. Her trust fund has been used to hide losses for years. As Julian processed this information, he watched Astrid carefully counting out change for a customer who'd paid in crumpled bills, treating the small transaction with the same attention she'd once reserved for million-dollar foundation galas. The transformation was remarkable, and it made what he was learning about her family's crimes infinitely more complicated. That evening, Astrid sat in the employee cafeteria, picking at a meal that cost more than she'd ever spent on lunch in her previous life, $3.50 for processed food that bore no resemblance to the organic, artisanal cuisine she was accustomed to. Around her, conversations flowed in a mixture of Spanish, English, and tired laughter that spoke to resilience she was only beginning to understand. "Rough day?" asked David Kim, a maintenance worker who'd been kind to her since her first week. He was the first colleague who'd shown her genuine friendship rather than skeptical tolerance. "Getting better," Astrid replied, surprised to realize she meant it. I'm starting to understand the rhythm. It takes time. Most people from privileged backgrounds don't last a month. There was something pointed in the way David said privileged backgrounds that made Astrid wonder exactly how much her coworkers knew about her real identity. What gave me away? David smiled, gesturing toward her hands. Manicure that costs more than my weekly rent. Designer watch you forgot to remove. The way you hold yourself when you think nobody's looking. Heat flooded Astrid's cheeks. Am I that obvious? To us, yeah. But not necessarily to management. David leaned closer, lowering his voice. Word of advice. Some of the supervisors are betting on how long you'll last. Don't give them the satisfaction of being right. The casual cruelty of being wagered on by people she was trying to build relationships with stung more than Astrid expected. But it also strengthened her resolve to prove them wrong, not because of pride, but because she was beginning to genuinely care about earning their respect. Have you seen much of the owner? She asked, trying to sound casual. Julian Westbrook. Mr. Westbrook keeps his distance from day-to-day operations, David replied. Rumor is he sometimes walks through disguised as other employees, checking on how things really work. But nobody knows for sure. Astrid's pulse quickened. The suspicion that had been nagging at her since their dinner meeting crystallized into near certainty. Julian Westbrook and the maintenance worker from her first day were the same person, which meant her humiliation had been witnessed by the one man who now controlled her family's fate. The realization was both mortifying and strangely exciting. If Julian had seen her at her worst and still offered the contract, what did that mean about his true intentions? Her phone buzzed with a text from her father, Foundation board meeting tomorrow. They're asking questions about missing funds. Need to talk urgently. The message sent ice through her veins. Missing funds could only mean one thing. Someone had discovered the financial irregularities that Charles had been assuring her were minor accounting errors. Astrid excused herself from the cafeteria and found a quiet corner to call her father, her hands shaking as she dialed. Daddy? What's happening with the foundation? Astrid, thank God. Listen carefully, there's going to be an investigation. Someone's been feeding information to the board about transfers between your trust fund and foundation accounts. What kind of transfers? The ones I used to cover our losses over the past few years. It was temporary, just moving money around to maintain cash flow, but it looks like embezzlement. Astrid felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. How much money are we talking about? $12 million. Maybe more. The number hit her like a physical blow. $12 million moved illegally through accounts she'd had signing authority on since her 21st birthday. Did you know about this when you signed those papers? Charles asked, his voice carrying a desperation that made her stomach turn. I trusted you, Astrid whispered. I signed whatever you put in front of me because I trusted you. I was trying to save the company, to preserve what your mother built. By using my name to commit felonies. The silence on the other end of the line told her everything she needed to know. Charles Cole, the father who taught her that family loyalty was everything, had made her an unwitting accomplice to crimes that could destroy what little remained of her life. As Astrid stood in the hotel service corridor, wearing a polyester uniform and facing the possibility of prison time for crimes she'd committed through ignorance and trust, she realized that Julian Westbrook's employment contract might be the least of her problems. Her family's foundation, her mother's legacy, the one thing she believed was pure and untouchable, was built on lies that went deeper than she'd ever imagined. And somewhere in this hotel, the man who claimed to want to teach her about genuine human character was watching her world collapse, knowing exactly how deep the corruption ran. The question was whether Julian Westbrook was her salvation or her destruction, and whether there was any difference between the two. The knock on Astrid's apartment door came at 11:43 p.m., 3 sharp raps that echoed through the thin walls of employee housing like gunshots. She'd been pacing her tiny living space for hours, trying to process the implications of her father's confession about the foundation funds, when the sound made her freeze mid-step. "Astrid?" Julian's voice carried through the door, softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's me. We need to talk." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the door. 6 weeks of working under his indirect supervision, 6 weeks of stolen glances across hotel lobbies and brief encounters in elevators, had built a tension between them that felt dangerous and inevitable. She opened the door to find Julian standing in the hallway, no longer the polished businessman from their dinner meeting but someone who looked almost vulnerable. His expensive suit had been replaced by dark jeans and a simple sweater, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Do you know what time it is?" she asked, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, she'd been hoping he would come. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stepping inside when she moved back from the doorway. "I've been watching the security footage from today. The way you handled Mrs. Patterson's complaint about her missing jewelry, you didn't just solve the problem. You made her feel heard." Astrid closed the door, acutely aware of how small her apartment felt with Julian's presence filling it. "That's my job." "No, that's who you're becoming." Julian moved to the window, looking out at the city lights that painted the employee housing complex in shades of gold and shadow. 6 weeks ago, you would have dismissed her as a hysterical old woman. Tonight, you spent 2 hours personally searching her room and coordinating with housekeeping to find her wedding ring. It was important to her. Exactly. Julian turned to face her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You're learning to see people as fully human, not just obstacles or resources. It's remarkable." The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest, but it was tinged with confusion. "Why does it matter to you? I mean, really matter?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. "Because I've spent years believing that people like you, people born into privilege, raised with every advantage, were incapable of genuine empathy. You're proving me wrong. People like me. People who've never had to choose between dignity and survival. People who've never had their worth measured by their usefulness to others. People who've never been invisible." There was pain in his voice that made Astrid step closer, drawn by an instinct to comfort that surprised her. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I am." Julian's laugh was bitter. "I grew up in the system, foster care, group homes, aging out at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a chip on my shoulder. Everything I've built, every dollar I've earned, came from understanding that the world doesn't owe anyone anything." The revelation hit Astrid like cold water. The polished businessman, the mysterious investor who commanded respect and wielded power like a weapon, he'd started with less than nothing. "How did you build all this?" she asked, gesturing toward the window that framed his empire of lights and glass. "By being ruthless. By making the hard choices that privileged people never have to make. By convincing myself that compassion was a luxury I couldn't afford." Julian moved closer, and Astrid could see the conflict in his eyes, something that looked like regret mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "But watching you these past weeks," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "seeing you choose kindness when it costs you something, when it gains you nothing, it's changing how I see everything." The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Astrid found herself thinking about the way he'd looked at her during their dinner meeting, the careful attention he'd paid to her progress, the late-night security footage reviews that went far beyond normal business oversight. "Julian," she said, her voice unsteady, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "What?" "The janitor who touched my car 6 weeks ago. The one I humiliated in your lobby. That was you, wasn't it?" The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Finally, Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. Yes. So you've been watching me all along. This job, the contract, the educational experience, it was all planned. Yes. Astrid felt something crack inside her chest. Was any of it real? The conversation we just had, the way you've been looking at me. Everything I just told you was real, Julian said urgently, reaching toward her before stopping himself. Astrid, whatever else you think about my methods, what's happening between us? What's happening between us is based on lies, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure she believed them. The connection she felt to Julian, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the growing attraction that had been building despite every rational reason to resist it, it felt genuine in ways that had nothing to do with deception. Not lies, Julian said firmly. Incomplete information. Context you weren't ready for. What context? What aren't you telling me? Julian moved to the small table where Astrid kept the few personal items she'd been allowed to bring from her old life, a photo of her mother, a jewelry box with Eleanor Cole's initials engraved on the lid, a leather-bound journal that had belonged to her grandmother. He picked up the photograph, studying Eleanor's face with an expression that made Astrid's blood run cold. Your mother was beautiful, he said quietly. Inside and out. She was the only person who ever treated me like I mattered when the world had written me off as worthless. Astrid felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. You knew my mother. Eleanor Cole hired me when I was 19, fresh out of the foster system with a criminal record and no prospects. I'd been arrested for breaking into abandoned buildings, sleeping there because I had nowhere else to go. Instead of prosecuting, she offered me a job at the foundation. The photograph trembled in Julian's hands. She saw something in me that no one else had bothered to look for. Potential. Intelligence. The possibility that circumstances don't define character permanently. That's impossible, Astrid whispered. I would have known. She would have mentioned. She mentored dozens of young people through the foundation's outreach programs. I was just one of many projects to her, but she was everything to me. The first person who believed I could become someone worth believing in. Julian set the photograph down carefully, his movements precise and controlled. I worked for the foundation for 3 years. Eleanor taught me about business, about integrity, about using success to lift others up instead of keeping them down. I was going to spend my life honoring what she'd given me. What happened? Your father happened. Julian's voice turned hard as winter. Charles Cole saw my devotion to Eleanor as a threat. He convinced her that I was getting too attached, that my feelings for her were inappropriate, unprofessional. He had me fired and blacklisted from every charity organization in the city. Astrid sank into the only chair her apartment offered, trying to process what Julian was telling her. My father ruined your life. He destroyed my chance at the life Eleanor had helped me envision. But he gave me something else, motivation. I spent the next 15 years building an empire specifically to prove that the worthless foster kid he dismissed could rise higher than the privileged prince he was grooming to inherit everything. The truth was worse than anything Astrid had imagined. Julian hadn't sought out her family as a potential investment, he'd been planning their destruction for over a decade. The Singapore deal, she said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. You sabotaged it. Morrison Industries is one of my subsidiary companies. When I learned about Cole Industries' vulnerability, I saw an opportunity for justice. Justice? Astrid's voice rose with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. You destroyed my family for revenge against something that happened 15 years ago. I destroyed your family because they deserved it, Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction. Charles Cole built his empire on exploitation and corruption. Your foundation, your mother's legacy, was being used to launder money and hide losses. Someone needed to stop it. So you stopped it by ruining innocent people's lives? What innocent people? Julian's mask of control was beginning to crack. Your father's employees who lost their jobs when he overextended the company chasing profits. The families depending on foundation services that were being cut to hide embezzlement. The investors who trusted Charles with their retirement funds. Me, Astrid said quietly. You ruined my life, Julian. Everything I believed about my family, my future, my identity, you took it all away. I gave you the chance to become someone real, Julian shot back. Someone who earns respect instead of demanding it, who understands that privilege comes with responsibility. You gave me a prison sentence disguised as employment. You've been watching me struggle, documenting my humiliation, probably laughing at how the spoiled rich girl handles poverty. No. Julian's voice cut through her anger like a blade. I've been falling in love with the woman you're becoming. The confession hung in the air between them, more devastating than any accusation or revelation. Astrid felt her carefully constructed fury crumble as she stared at Julian's face, seeing genuine anguish in his eyes. Don't, she whispered. Don't you dare use love as justification for what you've done. I'm not justifying anything, Julian said, stepping closer despite the danger radiating from her posture. I'm telling you that somewhere in the middle of watching you transform from someone I despised into someone I admire, everything changed. The plan stopped mattering. The revenge stopped mattering. You started mattering. When? The question came out broken, desperate. When did you decide that my feelings might matter more than your 15-year grudge? Julian's face crumpled. Tonight. When I watched you comfort Mrs. Patterson about her wedding ring, and I realized you were showing more genuine care for a stranger than anyone had ever shown me before Eleanor. When I understood that you'd become the person she always believed people could become, given the right chances. Astrid stood slowly, the weight of everything Julian had told her settling into her bones like lead. So what happens now? Do you call off your dogs and restore my family's fortune? Do we pretend this was all some elaborate courtship ritual? I can't undo what's already in motion, Julian said quietly. The federal investigation into the foundation's finances launched 3 days ago. Charles will be arrested within the week, probably charged with multiple felonies. And me? That depends on what you choose to do next. Julian pulled out his phone, showing her a screen full of legal documents. I can provide evidence that you were manipulated into signing those authorization forms, that you had no knowledge of your father's crimes. Your signature was forged on the worst transactions. You'll face civil penalties but avoid criminal charges. In exchange for what? Nothing. No conditions, no contracts, no expectations. Julian's voice was raw with exhaustion. I'm not asking you to forgive me or trust me or continue working here. I'm asking you to let me fix what I broke, even if you walk away hating me forever. Astrid stared at the man who'd systematically destroyed her life while teaching her to become someone worth saving. The complexity of her emotions, rage and gratitude, betrayal and attraction, devastation and hope, threatened to tear her apart. I need you to leave, she said finally. Julian nodded, moving toward the door with the careful movements of someone trying not to shatter something fragile. Astrid? What? Your mother would be proud of who you're becoming. Whatever else you believe about my motivations, believe that. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Astrid alone in her tiny apartment with the ruins of everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the difference between justice and revenge. Outside, Julian Westbrook stood in the hallway for a long moment, his hand pressed against the door that separated him from the woman he'd unwittingly taught himself to love while trying to teach her to be worthy of the love she'd never known she needed. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure if he was the hero or the villain of his own story. And for the first time since Eleanor Cole had given him hope for redemption, he wondered if some sins were too complex to be forgiven, even by the people who'd learned to commit grace in spite of everything that had been taken from them. 5 days after Julian's midnight confession, FBI agents arrived at the Grand Meridian Hotel at 6:47 a.m. with a warrant for Astrid's arrest. She was refilling coffee dispensers in the employee break room when Agent Sarah Martinez and Agent David Park appeared in the doorway, their federal badges cutting through the morning routine like cold steel. Astrid Cole. Agent Martinez's voice carried the professional detachment of someone who destroyed lives as a matter of bureaucratic procedure. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and misappropriation of charitable funds. The coffee pot slipped from Astrid's hands, shattering against the linoleum floor in a cascade of glass and scalding liquid. Around her, her co-workers, people who'd become something like friends over the past month, stopped their conversations and stared as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. "I want a lawyer," Astrid managed, but her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. "You'll have that opportunity," Agent Park replied, guiding her toward the service elevator with the gentle firmness of someone who'd done this countless times before. "Right now, we need you to come with us." As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Astrid caught a glimpse of Julian standing in the lobby, his face pale with something that looked like genuine anguish. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and she saw him mouth 2 words, "I'm sorry." But sorry couldn't undo the handcuffs, couldn't erase the charges, couldn't repair the trust that had been shattered beyond recognition. The federal building where they processed her arrest was a monument to institutional indifference, gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of furniture designed to remind suspects that they were no longer in control of their own destinies. Astrid's fingerprints were taken, her photograph captured from multiple angles, and her personal effects catalogued with mechanical precision. "Your bail hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Agent Martinez explained as they led her to a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair. "Your father's attorney has already been notified." Charles Cole's attorney turned out to be a public defender named Robert Chen, no relation to Rebecca or the Chen family from Julian's staff, who looked like he'd been overwhelmed by difficult cases since law school graduation. He met with Astrid in a conference room that felt designed to extract confessions through psychological pressure. "Your father was arrested this morning," Robert said without preamble, consulting a legal pad covered in hasty notes. "The charges are extensive: wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, conspiracy. The prosecution is claiming he stole over $20 million from the foundation over a 5-year period." $20 million. The number was so much larger than the $12 million Charles had admitted to that Astrid felt reality shifting around her like quicksand. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The foundation doesn't even have $20 million in total assets." "Actually, it does. Or it did." Robert flipped through documents that painted a picture of financial complexity far beyond anything Astrid had imagined. "Your mother's will establish a trust with significant holdings, real estate, stock portfolios, art collections. Your father has been liquidating those assets and hiding the transactions through shell companies and offshore accounts." The conference room felt like it was shrinking around her. "My mother's trust was supposed to fund the foundation's work. Education programs, housing assistance, mentorship for at-risk youth. All of which were gradually reduced or eliminated as your father diverted funds to cover losses in his construction business. The people those programs were designed to help. They've been abandoned so Charles Cole could maintain his lifestyle." Robert opened a file folder that contained photographs of facilities that should have been maintained with foundation money, a youth center with broken windows, a homeless shelter that had been shuttered for lack of funding, scholarship recipients who'd been told their aid was being discontinued. "This is what your signature authorized," Robert continued, showing her documents that bore her name and what looked like her handwriting. "Transfers that ended programs your mother specifically endowed to continue in perpetuity." Astrid stared at the signatures, her mind reeling. They looked authentic, but she had no memory of signing papers that would destroy her mother's legacy so thoroughly. "I never signed these," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she remembered countless times when Charles had presented her with routine paperwork that needed her authorization. Documents he'd assured her were standard administrative procedures, signed during family dinners or holiday gatherings when she was distracted by conversation and wine. "Can you prove that?" Astrid faltered, realizing that her word against physical evidence would carry little weight in federal court. "I trusted my father. I signed what he told me to sign because I believed he was protecting our family's interests. Unfortunately, ignorance isn't a defense against federal fraud charges. The prosecution will argue that as a board member and signatory, you had a fiduciary responsibility to understand what you were authorizing." Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression carrying the tired sympathy of someone who delivered bad news to desperate families more times than he could count. "However, there's been an unusual development. Someone has provided the FBI with evidence that many of your signatures were forged using sophisticated document manipulation technology. Bank records showing that you were out of the country when several key authorizations were supposedly signed. Security footage that contradicts the prosecution's timeline. Who provided that evidence?" "The documentation came through a law firm that represents several high-net-worth individuals in the city. They claim their client wishes to remain anonymous but has extensive proof of your father's deception." Astrid didn't need to ask who the anonymous benefactor was. Julian's promise to provide evidence of her innocence was apparently being fulfilled, but the knowledge brought no relief, only a deeper sense of being manipulated by forces beyond her control. "What does that mean for my case?" "It means the prosecution might be willing to consider a plea agreement where you testify against your father in exchange for reduced charges. Community service instead of prison time." "Testify against my father?" "Tell the truth about his manipulation, about how he used your trust and your mother's memory to commit fraud. Help them understand the full scope of the damage he's caused." The choice was impossible. Protect Charles Cole, the man who'd raised her, taught her about family loyalty, held her when she'd cried after Eleanor's death, and faced decades in federal prison. Or betray him to save herself, ensuring that he would spend his remaining years behind bars. "I need to think about this," Astrid said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning." "But Astrid," Robert's voice softened with what might have been genuine concern. "I've seen cases like this before. Family loyalty is admirable, but your father made choices that put you in this position. You don't owe him your freedom." That evening, Astrid sat in her cell trying to reconcile the man who'd tucked her into bed every night after her mother's death with the criminal who'd systematically destroyed Eleanor's legacy. The Charles Cole she'd loved was gentle, protective, devoted to preserving everything good about their family. But the evidence suggested that same man had been stealing from programs designed to help people like Julian, young people who'd aged out of foster care with nothing but determination and the hope that someone might give them a chance. Her phone call privilege allowed her to contact one person, and she found herself dialing Julian's number before she could reconsider the wisdom of reaching out to the man who'd orchestrated her family's downfall. "Astrid?" His voice carried relief and anxiety in equal measure. "Are you okay?" "I've been trying to." "Did you know?" she interrupted, her voice flat with exhaustion. "When you were planning all this, when you decided to destroy my family, did you know about the youth programs?" The silence on the other end of the line told her everything she needed to know. "Yes," Julian said finally. "I knew. The mentorship program that helped kids like you. The scholarship fund that gave foster children college opportunities. The housing assistance that kept vulnerable families off the streets." Astrid's voice was gaining strength as her anger built. "You knew my father was stealing from people who needed that money to survive. I knew, and I was furious about it. Astrid, those programs meant everything to me. When I discovered Charles was dismantling them. You let him continue. For months, while you planned your elaborate revenge, you let him steal from people who had nothing because it served your purposes to let my family destroy itself completely. That's not, I tried to stop it through legal channels first, but destroying us publicly was more satisfying than protecting the victims. Astrid felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilling over. You're no better than he is, Julian. You both used other people's pain to get what you wanted. Astrid, please. No. I'm done being used by men who think their pain justifies everyone else's suffering. I'm done being a pawn in games I never chose to play. She hung up before Julian could respond, leaving herself alone with the crushing weight of understanding that there were no heroes in her story, only people who'd caused different kinds of damage while convincing themselves they were justified. The next morning brought another impossible choice when Agent Martinez returned with new evidence that changed everything Astrid thought she knew about her mother's death. We've been investigating your father's business practices going back 15 years, Agent Martinez explained, settling into the interview room chair across from Astrid. We discovered some irregularities around the time of your mother's passing. She opened a file folder that contained medical records, insurance documents, and photographs that made Astrid's blood turn to ice. Your mother didn't die from cancer, Miss Cole. She died from poisoning, specifically, a rare toxin that mimics the symptoms of aggressive lymphoma. The same toxin was found in tissue samples that were preserved from her autopsy. The room tilted sideways. Astrid gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what Agent Martinez was telling her. That's impossible. My mother was sick for months. I watched her deteriorate, watched her fight. She was being poisoned gradually over a period of approximately 6 months. The medical records show that her symptoms began shortly after she discovered discrepancies in the Foundation's financial records. Agent Martinez placed a document in front of Astrid, a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before her death. Your mother wrote this to the FBI, requesting an investigation into what she suspected were fraudulent transactions authorized by your father. She never had the chance to send it. Astrid read her mother's words through tears that blurred her vision. I believe my husband has been using our daughter's trust fund and our foundation's resources to cover losses in his business ventures. I have evidence of systematic financial manipulation that violates both federal law and the sacred trust we hold toward the communities we serve. My father killed my mother. The words came out as a whisper, but they echoed in the small room like screams. We believe so. The evidence suggests Eleanor discovered his embezzlement and threatened to expose him. Charles chose to eliminate the threat rather than face the consequences of his actions. The revelation destroyed the last foundation of Astrid's identity. Her father hadn't just been a flawed businessman who'd made desperate choices, he was a murderer who'd killed the woman he'd claimed to love to protect his own interests. The plea agreement we discussed yesterday. Agent Martinez continued gently. It's even more important now. Your testimony could help us prove first-degree murder charges against your father. Your mother deserves justice, Miss Cole. As Astrid sat in that sterile interview room, faced with the choice between protecting her father's freedom and honoring her mother's memory, she realized that Julian's revenge had been far more comprehensive than she'd imagined. He hadn't just destroyed the Cole family's financial empire, he'd ensured that every lie, every crime, every betrayal would be exposed with devastating precision. And now Astrid had to decide whether Charles Cole deserved her loyalty or her mother deserved her justice, knowing that either choice would condemn her to live with consequences that would haunt her forever. Outside the federal building, Julian Westbrook sat in his car with his head in his hands, finally understanding that some victories cost more than defeats ever could. He'd wanted to teach Astrid about justice and accountability, but he'd never intended for her to learn that her father was capable of murder. Some truths, he was beginning to realize, were too devastating to be called gifts, even when they came wrapped in the promise of redemption. The federal courthouse steps were slick with October rain when Astrid emerged from her final pre-trial meeting, her decision weighing on her shoulders like lead armor. 24 hours to choose between testifying against her father or facing 30 years in federal prison, 24 hours to decide whether justice or loyalty would define the rest of her life. She pulled her cheap raincoat, a far cry from the designer wool she'd once worn, tighter around her shoulders and started walking through the government district, needing movement to quiet the chaos in her mind. The city looked different from this perspective, seen through the eyes of someone whose freedom hung in the balance rather than someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Astrid. She turned to find Julian approaching through the rain, his expensive umbrella a stark reminder of the wealth and power he wielded while she faced ruin. But something in his expression stopped the angry words that had been building in her throat for days. "I know you don't want to see me," he said, stopping a careful distance away. "But there's something you need to know before you make your decision tomorrow." "Nothing you tell me is going to change anything," Astrid replied, but she didn't walk away. Despite everything, the lies, the manipulation, the systematic destruction of her family, part of her still felt drawn to this man who'd seen through her masks and challenged her to become someone real. "Your mother's letter to the FBI," Julian continued, pulling out a manila envelope that looked worn from handling. "The one Agent Martinez showed you. There's more to it. More lies you've orchestrated. More truth you deserve to have." Julian's voice carried a weight that made her pause. "Eleanor didn't just write to the FBI about the embezzlement. She wrote about me." Astrid felt her pulse quicken as Julian handed her the envelope. Inside were photocopies of pages she hadn't seen, pages in her mother's familiar handwriting that made her breath catch. "I have reason to believe that Julian Webb, a former Foundation employee, may have been unfairly terminated by my husband 3 years ago. Julian's work with our youth mentorship program was exemplary, and his dismissal appears to have been motivated by personal jealousy rather than professional misconduct." Astrid looked up sharply. "Webb? Your real name is Julian Webb?" "Julian Westbrook is the name I chose when I built my business empire. Julian Webb was the kid your mother tried to save." His voice was barely audible over the rain. "Keep reading." "I believe Charles felt threatened by Julian's intelligence and dedication, and by my mentorship of someone he saw as beneath our family's station. Julian deserved better from us, and I fear my husband's actions may have driven a promising young man toward bitterness and destructive choices." The words hit Astrid like physical blows. Her mother had known about Charles's treatment of Julian, had recognized the injustice, had planned to address it before her death. "She was going to find you," Astrid whispered. "She was going to make it right. She was going to do more than that." Julian pulled out another document, a will amendment dated 2 weeks before Eleanor's death. She was changing her will to establish a special trust fund for victims of the foster care system. Julian Webb was named as the primary administrator. Astrid stared at the legal document, her mind reeling. She was going to give you control of part of the foundation. She was going to give me the chance to fulfill the mission I'd learned from her, using privilege and resources to lift up people the system had abandoned. Everything I've built over the past 15 years, everything I've achieved, it was supposed to be done in partnership with Eleanor Cole, not in spite of her family. The revelation reframed everything Astrid thought she understood about Julian's motivations. His revenge hadn't been born from simple rejection, it had grown from the murder of the woman who'd planned to make him family. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I wanted you to choose justice for the right reasons, not because you felt guilty about what your father took from me." Julian stepped closer, rain streaming down his face. "Your mother's murder wasn't just about covering up embezzlement. It was about destroying her plan to reform the foundation, to turn it into something that would actually help people like me." Astrid felt something break open in her chest, a knot of confusion and anger that had been building since her arrest. "So when you destroyed my family, you were really trying to fulfill her vision?" "I thought I was." But watching you these past months, seeing you become the person Eleanor always believed people could become, I realized I'd lost sight of what she actually taught me. Which was that transformation happens through love, not destruction. That you build people up by giving them chances to prove themselves, not by tearing down everything they thought they knew. Julian's voice cracked with emotion. Eleanor would have been ashamed of what I became in her name. The rain was falling harder now, turning the courthouse steps into a waterfall of gray stone and broken dreams. Astrid stood in the center of it, finally understanding the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped both their lives. "What happens if I testify tomorrow?" she asked. "Your father goes to prison for the rest of his life. The foundation's remaining assets get distributed to legitimate charities. You start over with a clean slate but no family left. And if I don't? You go to prison, your father probably escapes serious consequences, and Eleanor's murderer wins." Julian paused, studying her face. "But you maintain your loyalty to the man who raised you, even knowing what he did." The choice felt impossible because it was impossible. There was no path forward that didn't require sacrificing something essential to who she was. Family loyalty or moral justice. The father who'd shaped her childhood or the mother who'd died trying to protect others. "I need to ask you something," Astrid said, her voice steadying as she finally found solid ground beneath her feet. "And I need you to answer honestly, without trying to influence my decision. Anything. If my mother were alive today, if she could see everything that's happened, the embezzlement, the murder, the choice I'm facing tomorrow, what would she want me to do?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. "She would want you to choose the truth, even if it cost you everything. Not because she cared more about justice than family, but because she understood that real love sometimes requires protecting people from the consequences of enabling destructive behavior. Even if it meant sending her husband to prison. Especially if it meant preventing him from hurting anyone else the way he hurt her." Astrid nodded slowly, feeling something click into place, not relief, but clarity. The choice was still impossible, but now she understood that some impossible choices revealed character rather than destroying it. "Julian?" "Yes. I need you to know that I'm not making this decision because of what you've told me tonight, or because of what you did to bring my family down, or because of what I feel for you." She stepped closer, rain soaking through her inadequate clothing but no longer caring. "I'm making it because it's what my mother would have done, and because it's who I want to be." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to testify. I'm going to tell the truth about everything, the signatures I was manipulated into providing, the programs Charles destroyed, the murder he committed to cover his crimes. I'm going to make sure Eleanor Cole's real legacy lives on." Julian's face crumpled with relief and something that looked like pride. "Astrid. But I'm not doing it for you," she continued firmly. "I'm not doing it to earn your approval or because I think it will fix what's broken between us. I'm doing it because it's right, regardless of the cost." For the first time since she'd learned about Julian's deception, Astrid felt like herself, not the entitled socialite she'd been, not the manipulated victim she'd become, but someone who could make difficult choices based on her own moral compass rather than external pressure. "I understand," Julian said quietly. "And for what it's worth, Eleanor would be proud of the woman you've become." "I hope so." Astrid turned to walk away, then paused. "Julian. After tomorrow, after the trial, after everything's finished, I don't know if I'll be able to forgive what you did. But I want you to know that what we had these past few months, the connection we built while I was learning to be someone real, that wasn't fake, was it?" "It was the most real thing that's ever happened to me," Julian replied, his voice barely audible over the rain. Astrid nodded and walked away, her steps growing stronger with each stride. Tomorrow, she would destroy what remained of her old life to honor the memory of a mother who died trying to protect people like Julian from people like Charles. Tonight, for the first time in her adult life, she would make a choice based entirely on her own conscience rather than on what others expected from her. The girl who'd once demanded respect she hadn't earned was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that real strength came not from having power over others, but from having the courage to do what was right even when it cost everything. As Astrid disappeared into the rainy night, Julian remained on the courthouse steps, finally understanding that love sometimes meant watching someone walk away, knowing they were walking toward a version of themselves that was worth the journey, even if that journey led them beyond your reach. Tomorrow would bring testimony that would reshape both their futures in ways neither could predict. But tonight, for the first time since Eleanor's death, Julian felt something approaching peace. Justice, he was learning, looked different when it was chosen rather than imposed. And Astrid Cole, no longer a victim of manipulation or a pawn in someone else's game, had chosen to become the kind of person who made justice possible. The impossible choice had been made, and somehow, in choosing the hardest path, she'd found her way home to herself. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity when Astrid took the witness stand on a crisp November morning that felt like the turning point between seasons. Media crews lined the hallway, their cameras capturing every moment of what prosecutors had dubbed the trial of the decade, a case that had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of charity, politics, and high society. Astrid wore a simple navy dress that she'd bought with her hotel wages, her appearance deliberately modest compared to the designer armor she'd once hidden behind. As she raised her right hand to take the oath, she caught sight of Julian in the gallery, his face carrying a mixture of anxiety and something that looked like faith in her ability to handle whatever came next. Charles Cole sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit and perfect posture a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit he'd worn during his arrest. For the past 3 months, he'd been held without bail, classified as a flight risk after investigators discovered offshore accounts in countries with no extradition treaties. But it was the way he looked at his daughter, with disappointment rather than love, calculation rather than concern, that finally severed the last emotional threads binding Astrid to the man who'd raised her. "Miss Cole," Prosecutor Janet Walsh began, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who'd spent months building an airtight case, "can you tell the court about your relationship with the Cole Foundation?" "I was appointed to the board when I turned 21, Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "My mother established the foundation to provide educational opportunities, housing assistance, and mentorship programs for underserved youth. It was supposed to be her legacy of helping people who'd been abandoned by the system." "And what was your role in the foundation's operations?" "Initially, I thought I was providing oversight and continuity. My father told me the board appointments and financial authorizations I signed were routine administrative matters. I trusted him to protect my mother's vision." Prosecutor Walsh moved to the evidence table, lifting a folder thick with documents. "These are authorization forms bearing your signature, approving the transfer of over $18 million from foundation accounts to shell companies controlled by your father. Do you recognize your signature?" Astrid studied the documents, her heart pounding as she recognized the careful forgeries that had been used to implicate her in crimes she'd never consciously committed. "Some of those signatures are mine," she said clearly. "But others are forgeries. Very sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless." The courtroom erupted in whispers as Prosecutor Walsh displayed enlarged photographs showing microscopic differences in pen pressure and letter formation that proved the document manipulation. "How do you know some are forgeries?" "Because I have perfect recall of every document I actually signed, and several of these are dated when I was out of the country. But more importantly, because my mother taught me to read everything before signing, and these documents authorize things I would never have agreed to. Such as the closure of the youth mentorship program that was specifically endowed in her will. The elimination of housing assistance for families transitioning out of homelessness. The cancellation of scholarships for foster children aging out of the system. Astrid's voice grew stronger with each revelation. These weren't administrative matters, they were the deliberate destruction of everything my mother died trying to protect. Defense attorney Martin Price stood immediately. Objection. The witness is characterizing her mother's death in ways not supported by evidence. Actually, Your Honor, Prosecutor Walsh replied smoothly, we'd like to call the court's attention to new evidence that directly addresses that characterization. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for courtroom theatrics, leaned forward with interest. Proceed. Prosecutor Walsh approached the bench with a sealed envelope that made Charles Cole's face go ashen. Your Honor, yesterday evening we received evidence that fundamentally changes the scope of this case. We request permission to present what we believe to be Eleanor Cole's final communication. What kind of communication? A video message, recorded 3 days before her death and stored in a safety deposit box that was only recently discovered. The words hit the courtroom like an earthquake. Charles Cole whispered urgently to his attorney while Astrid felt the ground shifting beneath her once again. Her mother had left a video message. I'll allow it, Judge Hendricks decided. But the defense will have time to review the evidence and respond appropriately. The courtroom lights dimmed as a large screen descended from the ceiling. When Eleanor Cole's face appeared, pale but determined, clearly ill but undeniably lucid, Astrid felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally spill over. If you're watching this, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same gentle strength Astrid remembered from childhood, then I'm dead, and Charles believes he's gotten away with murder. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the media crews stopped their note-taking, transfixed by the woman speaking from beyond the grave. I've known for weeks that my husband has been poisoning me, Eleanor continued, her words delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd accepted her fate but refused to accept injustice. I have blood samples stored in a secure location, along with evidence of the toxin purchases and documentation of how Charles has been administering them. She held up a small vial of clear liquid. This is the same poison he's been putting in my coffee every morning for the past 6 months. I stopped drinking it 3 days ago, but the damage is already done. I have perhaps a week to ensure that justice is served and that my real legacy survives. Astrid gripped the witness stand, watching her mother reveal truths that recontextualized everything she believed about Eleanor's death. The Cole Foundation was never about charity, Eleanor continued. It was about revolution. Every program we funded, every person we helped, every scholarship we provided was part of a larger plan to systematically reform the systems that keep vulnerable people powerless. She gestured toward documents spread across what looked like a hotel room desk. I've been working with federal investigators, child welfare advocates, and reform-minded politicians to create a network of support that would make real change possible. The foundation was just the beginning. Eleanor's face hardened with determination that Astrid had never seen before. Charles discovered my plans when he found communications between me and Julian Webb, a young man I was mentoring who understood the foster care system's failures better than anyone. Charles fired Julian not because of inappropriate behavior, but because Julian was helping me design programs that would actually work. The camera angle shifted to show Eleanor holding up legal documents. I've changed my will to establish the Eleanor Cole Justice Network, with Julian Webb as the primary administrator. The Foundation's assets will be used to create lasting systemic change rather than temporary charity. Charles's embezzlement has actually helped by concentrating the funds in accounts that can be quickly deployed for maximum impact. Astrid felt her worldview reforming around this revelation. Her mother hadn't been a traditional philanthropist, she'd been a strategic revolutionary who'd used her position and resources to attack inequality at its source. Julian, Eleanor said, looking directly into the camera, if you're watching this, know that everything you learned about justice and transformation during your time with us is about to be put to the ultimate test. The Foundation's true mission will require you to work with people who've hurt you, to forgive those who've wronged you, and to build something beautiful from something that was broken. Eleanor's gaze seemed to shift, as if she were speaking to different viewers. Astrid, my darling daughter, if you're watching this, then you've probably learned terrible things about the man who raised you. But I need you to understand that your father wasn't always the person he became. The Charles I married was kind, generous, devoted to helping others. Greed and fear corrupted him, but that corruption doesn't erase the love he showed you after I was gone. Astrid sobbed openly now, understanding that her mother had known exactly what kind of choice her daughter would eventually have to make. The justice system will punish Charles for his crimes, Eleanor continued, but justice isn't the same as healing. Real healing requires transforming pain into purpose, using what we've learned from our suffering to prevent others from suffering in the same ways. The video shifted to show Eleanor at a desk, signing documents with deliberate precision. I'm establishing the Eleanor Cole Justice Network with an initial endowment of $200 million, money that Charles never knew I had, money that came from my family's estate and has been growing in secure accounts for 20 years. $200 million. The number was so large that it redefined everything Astrid thought she knew about her family's wealth and her mother's plans. This network will fund legal advocacy for foster children, housing programs that create actual stability rather than temporary shelter, educational opportunities that don't abandon young people after graduation, and mentorship programs that understand the difference between charity and empowerment. Eleanor looked directly into the camera with the intensity of someone delivering a final message to people she loved. To those who've been hurt by my family's failures, Julian, the foster children who lost their programs, the families who were abandoned when Charles stole their support, I offer not just apologies, but power. The power to build something better from the ashes of what was broken. The video ended with Eleanor holding up a key. Julian Webb has been named executor of my true estate. Astrid Cole has been named as the primary beneficiary, but only after she proves she understands the difference between inherited privilege and earned responsibility. The choice is yours, my darling daughter. You can use this inheritance to rebuild the life you lost, or you can use it to transform the system that creates loss for people like Julian. The screen went dark, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Astrid stared at the blank screen, finally understanding that her mother's death hadn't been the end of her vision, it had been the catalyst for something far more powerful. Judge Hendricks cleared her throat, bringing focus back to the legal proceedings. Mr. Cole, how do you plead to the additional charges of first-degree murder? Charles Cole stood slowly, his composure finally cracking under the weight of his dead wife's testimony. Guilty, he whispered. Guilty to all charges. The plea sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but Astrid barely heard the chaos around her. She was thinking about Julian, about the $200 million that was apparently hers to control, about the choice her mother had known she would eventually face. Inherited privilege or earned responsibility. Rebuilding the past or transforming the future. As Charles Cole was led away in handcuffs, finally accepting the consequences of his crimes, Astrid realized that her real trial was just beginning. Her mother had given her the resources to become either the person she'd been or the person she could choose to become. The difference was whether she would use Eleanor's legacy to rescue herself or to ensure that no one else would need rescuing in the same way. Looking across the courtroom at Julian, the man who'd loved her mother, who'd been wrongly destroyed by her father, who taught her what it meant to choose justice over comfort, Astrid finally understood what love looked like when it was built on truth rather than manipulation. It looked like the chance to transform pain into purpose, to choose each other freely rather than out of need, and to build something beautiful from everything that had been broken. Eleanor Cole's final gift hadn't been money or power, it had been the revelation that transformation was always possible, for individuals and systems alike, when someone was brave enough to choose the harder path that led toward justice. As the courtroom erupted in celebration and chaos, Astrid made her choice. Not about Julian, not about her future, but about who she wanted to become in the next moment and every moment after that. She chose to become someone worthy of the trust her mother had placed in her, someone capable of using inherited privilege to create earned opportunity for others, someone who understood that real victory looked like making sure the next person didn't have to fight the same battles. The girl who'd once screamed at a janitor for touching her car was gone forever. In her place stood a woman ready to change the world. 1 year later, Astrid stood in the lobby of the newly renovated Grand Meridian Hotel, watching a young woman who reminded her of herself struggle with the weight of what felt like an impossible situation. The girl, maybe 19, dressed in clothes that had seen better days, clutched a folder of documents while tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," the girl said to the desk clerk, her voice shaking with humiliation. "I know the reservation was guaranteed, but my card was declined. I need somewhere to stay tonight. I'm interviewing for college scholarships tomorrow, and if I don't make a good impression." Astrid approached quietly, remembering the terror of financial vulnerability that had once seemed unimaginable to someone born into privilege. The Eleanor Cole Justice Network had processed over 3,000 applications in its first year, but seeing need up close still affected her more powerfully than any statistic. "Excuse me," Astrid said gently, offering her business card to the desk clerk. "I'm Astrid Cole, director of the Justice Network. Please charge MS." She looked at the girl with encouraging warmth. "Sarah Chen," the girl whispered, recognizing the name from news stories but clearly not believing someone so famous would help her. "Please charge Ms. Chen's room to the Foundation's account," Astrid continued. "And upgrade her to a suite. Interview preparation requires a good night's sleep." The desk clerk, a young man who'd been hired through the hotel's new partnership with foster care transition programs, smiled as he processed the transaction. "Of course, Ms. Cole. Ms. Chen, you're all set." As Sarah Chen disappeared toward the elevators with profound gratitude and renewed hope, Astrid felt a presence beside her that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Still can't resist playing fairy godmother." Julian's voice carried gentle teasing mixed with the kind of affection that had grown from shared purpose rather than romantic fantasy. Someone wise once told me that transformation happens through giving people chances to prove themselves, Astrid replied, turning to face the man who'd become her closest partner in building something meaningful from the wreckage of their family's failures. Julian looked different than he had during their first meeting, less polished but more genuine, wearing clothes that suggested success without demanding recognition. The angry, vengeful businessman who'd orchestrated the Cole family's downfall had evolved into someone who understood the difference between justice and healing. The board meeting went well, he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the conference room where the Justice Network's monthly progress review was held. Better than well. We've placed 437 foster kids in stable housing over the past year. The scholarship program has a 96% college completion rate. The Legal Advocacy Division has overturned wrongful terminations for 6 families and prevented 12 children from aging out of care without support systems. They paused outside the conference room, where 24 staff members were preparing presentations that would have been impossible before Eleanor's posthumous gift. Former foster children who'd become social workers, reformed business leaders who'd learned to prioritize impact over profit, legal advocates who'd discovered that protecting the vulnerable was more satisfying than protecting the wealthy. And Charles? Julian asked quietly. Astrid's expression softened with complicated emotions. I visited him last week. He's different in prison. Smaller, somehow. He asked about the foundation, about whether we've been able to help the families he abandoned. What did you tell him? That forgiveness is a process, not a destination. That I'm working on understanding the difference between the father who loved me and the man who killed my mother. That healing takes time for everyone. Julian nodded, understanding the complexity of loving someone who'd caused irreparable harm. His own journey toward forgiving the foster care system that had failed him while working to reform it had taught him that anger and compassion could coexist until wisdom made space for both. There's something I need to tell you, Julian said, pulling out an envelope that looked official. The Peterson construction contract came through. They want the Justice Network to oversee the affordable housing project downtown. Julian, that's incredible. How many units? 200 apartments specifically designed for families transitioning out of foster care, with built-in support services and educational partnerships. His smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd learned to build instead of destroy. It's the kind of systemic change your mother envisioned. Astrid felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that Eleanor's vision was becoming reality in ways that exceeded even her mother's ambitious hopes. She knew, Astrid said quietly. Somehow, she knew that losing everything would teach us both what was worth building. The conference room doors opened, revealing Maria Santos, Astrid's former supervisor from her customer service days, now the Justice Network's director of operations. The woman who'd once taught a spoiled rich girl how to talk to customers with respect had become instrumental in designing programs that treated vulnerable families with the dignity she'd modeled in her hotel work. Ready for the presentation? Maria asked, her voice carrying pride in how far they'd all traveled from where they'd started. As they entered the conference room, Astrid caught sight of herself in the mirror-paneled wall. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the entitled socialite who'd screamed at a janitor for touching her car. This person wore clothes that were expensive enough to command respect but modest enough to avoid intimidation. Her posture spoke of confidence earned through struggle rather than inherited through birth. Most importantly, her eyes reflected someone who'd learned to see other people as fully human rather than as obstacles or resources. Before we begin, Astrid said to the assembled staff, I want to share something that happened in the lobby today. She told them about Sarah Chen, about the moment of recognition when she'd seen her former self reflected in someone else's crisis, about the profound privilege of being able to transform her inherited advantages into opportunities for others. A year ago, Astrid continued, someone very wise told me that real change happens when we understand that helping others helps ourselves. That transformation isn't just personal, it's systemic. That the goal isn't to rescue people from their circumstances, but to change the circumstances that create the need for rescue. She looked around the room at faces that represented every demographic, every background, every kind of strength that emerged from different kinds of struggle. Today, we're not just running programs or distributing money. We're proving that broken systems can be rebuilt by people who've been broken by those systems. We're demonstrating that the most effective advocates are often the people who've experienced the problems firsthand. The presentation that followed showcased a year of victories that felt revolutionary in their scope. Foster children who'd become mentors for younger kids in care. Formerly homeless families who designed better shelter policies. Young adults who'd aged out of the system and were now pursuing law degrees to become advocates for others facing similar challenges. But it was the final slide that made Astrid's heart race with recognition of how far they'd all traveled. Next month, Maria announced, we're opening the Eleanor Cole Leadership Academy, a residential program for foster children aged 16 to 24 that combines college preparation, job training, and practical life skills with leadership development specifically focused on social justice advocacy. The academy would be housed in a renovated mansion, the former Cole family estate that Astrid had donated to the foundation rather than selling to pay for her legal fees. The house where she'd grown up surrounded by privilege would become a place where young people learn to transform their pain into power. The first class will be 15 students, Maria continued. All former foster children, all committed to using their education to reform the systems that failed them. The program includes full scholarships, mentorship from professionals who share their backgrounds, and internships with organizations working on systemic change. As the meeting concluded and staff members dispersed to continue their work, Astrid found herself alone with Julian in the conference room where they'd spent countless hours turning Eleanor's vision into operational reality. "Are you happy?" Julian asked, the question carrying weight that went beyond simple contentment. Astrid considered the complexity of what happiness meant after everything they'd been through. "I'm purposeful," she said finally. "I'm useful in ways I never was before. I'm building something that will outlast me. I think that might be better than happy." "And us?" Julian's voice was careful, avoiding assumptions about what kind of relationship they'd built from the wreckage of revenge and manipulation. "We're partners," Astrid replied, but her smile suggested that partnership might be evolving into something deeper now that it was based on choice rather than circumstance. "We're two people who learned hard lessons about the difference between love and control, between justice and vengeance, between charity and empowerment." She stepped closer, drawn by attraction that had been tested by deception but strengthened by shared purpose. "We're also two people who might be ready to explore what a relationship looks like when it's built on truth instead of trauma." Julian's response was to take her hand, not with the desperate intensity of people clinging to each other in crisis, but with the steady warmth of someone who'd learned that real love was a choice made every day rather than a feeling that happened to you. "Your mother would be proud," he said, looking around the conference room where Eleanor's portrait hung beside photos of the young people whose lives had been transformed through the Justice Network. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," Astrid replied. "We took the worst thing that happened to us and turned it into the best thing we could do for other people." As they walked toward the lobby together, Astrid's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. "Interview went perfectly. Got the scholarship and wanted to thank you again. Someday I'm going to help kids the way you helped me today." The message was a reminder that transformation rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured or controlled. Every person they helped would help others, creating networks of support that extended far beyond any foundation or program. In the lobby, a new crisis was unfolding, a young man arguing with security about access to the building, his voice rising with the kind of desperation Astrid recognized from her own darkest moments. But instead of dismissing him as a disruption, the security guard was listening patiently, clearly trained to see distressed people as individuals who might need help rather than problems to be removed. "Can I assist you?" Astrid asked, approaching with the same gentle authority she'd learned from watching Julian handle difficult situations during his janitor days. "I'm looking for the Justice Network," the young man said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I aged out of foster care 6 months ago. I'm sleeping in my car, working 3 part-time jobs, trying to save money for community college, but everything costs so much more than I expected." "You found us," Astrid said simply. "And you're not alone anymore." As she led him toward the Justice Network's intake office, Astrid caught Julian's eye across the lobby. The look they shared contained everything they'd learned about turning pain into purpose, about building something beautiful from something that had been broken, about choosing each other and choosing justice with equal commitment. The wealthy socialite who'd once demanded respect she hadn't earned was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that real power came from using privilege to expand opportunity for others, that genuine love grew from choosing someone's highest good even when it cost you everything, and that the most satisfying victories were the ones that ensured other people didn't have to fight the same battles. As Astrid guided another young person toward resources and hope, she realized that her story had come full circle in the most beautiful way possible. She'd started as someone who used her power to diminish others and had become someone who used her power to lift others up. The transformation was complete, but the work, the daily choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to love rather than control, would continue forever. And that felt like the most perfect ending she could have chosen for herself, even if it looked nothing like the life she'd once thought she wanted. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the city where Eleanor Cole's vision was taking root and growing into something that would outlast them all, a network of justice that turned broken people into healers, victims into advocates, and inherited privilege into earned redemption. The revolution disguised as charity work was succeeding, one transformed life at a time.